Hi, and thanks for joining us. I'm Milton Lawrence from Rhino Linings USA. In this video, we'll be discussing the main components that make up the Rhino lining spraying equipment. We'll talk about each component and its function. Following that, we'll show you how all these pieces come together in preparation for the spraying of the product. Each component has a very specific purpose, helping you create the ideal sprayed-on polyurethane.
In addition to the equipment, we will also demonstrate the startup operations, a ratio check, a cup test, recirculation technique, and changing colors. Here we have all of the equipment arranged as it will be when it is ready to use. We will start with the white resin drum, which is always placed on the left of our equipment lineup. The resin drums are stored in a dry place, warm if possible. It is recommended to move the drums into the equipment room a minimum of 3 days prior to use. The resin is agitated 1 minute per gallon every 4 hours if spraying, and no agitation needed if not spraying. Moving on to the Desiccant Dryer cartridges, there are 3 Desiccant Dryers throughout the system. One is located on the resin drum, the second is located on the Isocyanate Drum, and the third is located on the QC tanks. These cartridges are responsible for filtering the air entering the drums and the QC tanks. This process will make your chemicals last longer and also help to prevent moisture contamination. When the blue indicator beads turn pink, it is important to change the cartridges. The drum agitator is used to mix the resin. The resin needs to be agitated every 4 hours at the rate of 1 minute per gallon. There are 2 sets of blades located on the agitator shaft. The drum agitator is air-powered and requires the regulated line from the lubricator assembly. Set the speed of the drum agitator according to the resin level. The transfer pump is used to transfer resin from the drum to the QC tanks. The pump is air-powered and uses the second air line from the lubricator assembly. Maintenance of the transfer pump includes greasing the piston as needed. A Y strainer is attached to the transfer pump to help filter out any particulates, which could clog the pump. It is very important to check the Y strainer at each drum change. Next in the lineup are the QC tanks, which are actually 6 11-gallon staging containers for the resin. The center tanks are plumbed together, providing a 22-gallon capacity for the black resin, since it is the most popular color. The outer 4 tanks are individual tanks, which allows for a total of 5 colors to be prepped. The valves on the color manifold determine which tank will deliver resin and which color gets sprayed. Each tank has a built-in agitator, and the mixing motor can be moved from tank to tank. Each tank also has a fitting for transferring and recirculating the material. The pigment is added through a 2-inch hole on the tank lids. Moving on to the lubricator assembly, which should be mounted on the wall right behind the QC tanks. This assembly directs the air from the compressor to the equipment as needed. The air from the compressor comes in from the top to the lubricator assembly. Located on the bottom is a moisture bleed valve. On the left side, the airline goes through an oiler and then onto the drum agitator and transfer pump. This oiler helps to keep these 2 components lubricated. The airline on the right side goes to the 40-pound Desiccant Dryer.
Let's go ahead and review the purpose of the 40-pound Desiccant Dryer. The dryer serves as a last defense against moisture in your spray air. As we'll see later, moisture is the enemy of sprayed polyurethane. The dryer is not intended to dry the air from your compressor completely, but rather to capture any residual water left in the air. Air comes in from the lubricator assembly, through a regulator, an oil trap, a water trap,
down through the pipe and up through the desiccant material, out through one last water trap, and directly to your spray gun. We have a heating element mounted at the top which is used to regenerate the desiccant beads when they become saturated with water. The heating element is controlled by a timer. Next to the desiccant dryer is the black isocyanate drum, which is positioned horizontally in the drum cradle. The isocyanate needs to be kept at a stable temperature. Drums are stored in a warm, dry place and should be 65 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. No agitation or pigmentation is required for the ISO. It is also recommended to move the drum into the equipment room a minimum of 3 days prior to use. The direct feed assembly is used to deliver the ISO to the proportioning unit. Attached to the top 2-inch opening is a desiccant dryer and a recirculation fitting. The dryer is designed to vent and dry the air going into the drum, and the recirculation fitting is used when you recirculate material. The clear sight tube allows the operator to see the level of the ISO in the drum, and the feed assembly at the bottom directs the ISO to the proportioning unit through a Y strainer which filters any particles which may be in the drum. The Y strainer must be inspected and cleaned at each drum change. This brings us to the proportioning unit, which is the heart of the equipment package. It precisely meters and delivers the ISO and resin to the spray gun. It operates on an exact pre-established non-adjustable ratio. The electric motor turns both the resin and ISO pumps. Each pump has a machined spacer that determines pump output. The comparison of each pump's output is the ratio. The ratio range is 0.58 to 0.62, with the ideal being 0.60. The operation of the proportioning unit is relatively simple, with the main power at the front of the base unit. The green light indicates the power to the unit is on. There are two ways to control the liquid volume: local and remote. There is a toggle switch located underneath the proportioning unit which allows you to switch between local and remote control. The local control rheostat is located at the right side of the base unit. Here you will also find one 4-amp resettable breaker and 2 fuses. These are your safeguards against overpressure and/or an electrical short circuit. The remote control rheostat increases or decreases liquid volume and also has a power cutoff switch. There are 50 feet of cable attaching the remote control to the base unit. Let's move on to the hose assembly shown here. The hose assembly contains 3 lines, 2 fluid lines and 1 red air line. One end of the fluid lines is connected to the ISO and resin pumps on the proportioning unit, and the red air line hooks to the 40-pound dryer. The hoses are insulated and then covered with a nylon sleeve for durability. The hose assembly should be kept warm and dry and must never, ever be folded or kinked. A kink in the hose will cause the machine to go off ratio because it restricts the chemical flow as it is being pumped. The fluid lines are 1/2 inch in ID and the air is 3/8 OD and are equipped with JIC fittings, ISO being 5/8 inch and resin being 1/2 inch. We use different size fittings on the 2 components so that the lines cannot be crossed and cause contamination. This brings us to the last major component, the gun assembly. It consists of a number of components including swivel fittings which allow the gun to rotate approximately 300 degrees, ball valves, a lever which opens and closes both ISO and resin valves simultaneously, 45-degree fittings which connect the valves to the gun manifold. The air line hooks through a quick connect, a regulator, and a purge valve. The air goes through a braided hose to a quick connect at the Rhino atomizer assembly. This assembly consists of an atomizer, a 3/8 inch static mixing tube, and a 3/8 inch aluminum retainer. The aluminum retainer attaches the static mixer to the gun manifold. Taking the static mixer off reveals the 2 ports from which the ISO and resin are dispensed. The static mixer combines the 2 liquids before they are sprayed, and threads directly into the manifold. It is disposable and has a one-time use. An air cap directs the pressurized air around the fluid stream to create the conical spray pattern.
Now that we've reviewed the key components of the Rhino equipment package, let's cover some of the typical activities you'll go through in working with the machine. Let's say you're ready to start the day and you have a black bed liner to spray. The basic process will involve the following steps:
Mixing the resin drum, transferring the resin to the appropriate QC tank, pigmenting the material and mixing, recirculating the material in the lines if it's your first spray of the day, and taking a ratio check and cup test. Let's go through the basic steps for performing these startup operations. To begin the process, you need to begin with mixing the resin. Be sure to turn on the agitator on the resin drum to mix 1 gallon per minute. It is a good idea to wrap a clean shop rag around the muffler to absorb moisture. Once the drum is mixed, you will attach the resin transfer hose to the JIC fitting on top of the desired QC tank. In this case, we attach to the center tank for a black application. Start the transfer of resin by turning the air on to the transfer pump. The center tanks are connected. After transferring resin for a couple of minutes, the material will automatically transfer into the rear tank, leveling off the front unit. When you turn off the transfer pump, first close the air valve so that it releases the pressure from the pump. Detach the transfer line from the QC tank and cap it. Drape the line over the resin tank. Now transfer the air line to the agitator pump and then attach the agitator pump to the black QC tank. Turn it on and add 80 grams of pigment per gallon of material, adding it slowly, scraping container with a tongue depressor to ensure enough pigment is mixed in. The pigment is quite thick in viscosity. Therefore, it is very important to turn the agitator on before adding pigment to prevent the pigment from settling straight to the bottom. As before, you might want to tie a clean shop rag around the muffler to prevent moisture from dripping. Remember to mix the pigment with the same 1 minute per gallon rule. Once the front tank is finished mixing, transfer the agitator pump to the rear tank and repeat pigment addition process.
If this is your first spray application of the day, you'll want to recirculate the material that's been sitting in the hoses. The recirculation process is pretty straightforward.
We are going to remove the hoses from the gun assembly, capping the openings. Attach the resin hose to the QC tank and attach the ISO hose to the ISO recirculation fitting on the ISO drum. Open valve from the black tank on the QC manifold before turning on the proportioning unit. Turn the power to the machine on and dial the rheostat to a setting of 30 to 40 to get the pumps going. Run the machine for about 10 to 15 minutes to recirculate, and then reattach hoses to gun assembly.
You're now ready to take a ratio check and cup test. It's critical that you run these two tests every day before spraying or after every drum change. They allow you to make sure the chemicals and equipment are functioning properly before you start spraying a truck or whatever your application happens to be. You know the old saying, better safe than sorry.
For the ratio test, you will need your scale, calculator, styrofoam cups, tongue depressors, gloves, rags, and a stopwatch or watch with a second hand. Holding the gun over a waste bucket, first open the fluid valves, then turn the machine on, either locally or with the remote. Holding both styrofoam cups in one hand, move the cups into the two liquid streams pouring out of the gun. Fill the resin cup about halfway, then slide both cups away at the same time. Shut off the machine, then turn the valves off. Now tear an empty cup on the scale. Then weigh the ISO. Put that number into your calculator. Now weigh the resin and divide the ISO number by the resin number. This gives you the ratio at which the machine is currently operating at. You should write this number every time onto your ratio log. This number should be between 0.59 to 0.61. If not, you should retake the cup test. It is extremely important to get the proper ratio. A bad ratio will result in problems with the lining. Please see the troubleshooting video for information on fixing a bad ratio. Once you've checked the ratio, we can use the same cups of ISO and resin to do a cup test. Pour the ISO into the resin cup, making sure you scrape as much out as possible. Turn your stopwatch on. Begin stirring with the tongue depressor. Scrape the sides of the cup as you are stirring. You should feel the cup getting warm and the material start thickening. The gel time is the time it takes to solidify completely where you cannot stir anymore. At a temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the gel time should be about 15 to 25 seconds. If the gel time is unusually long, call the tech department for assistance. Take a look at the material. It should have the following characteristics: shiny surface, tough flexible elastomer, and no foaming or material rising in the cup.
Now, one last operation you'll be faced with routinely if you offer multiple colors is changing the color of the material. For example, let's say you've been spraying black and need to switch to a red liner for a customer. What's the best way to switch colors without wasting any material? Let's show you.
Changing colors is made up of 3 basic steps, which include pushing the black out of the hoses with clear material and back into the black QC tank. Then push the clear out with the color we're changing to, in this case red. Finally, we pigment both colors to account for the clear resin we have pushed into each tank. Connect the resin transfer hose to the main fitting on top of the QC tank manifold. Open the center manifold and then close the color, black, that we are flushing. We are going to remove the hoses from the gun assembly, capping the openings. Move the fluid lines from the gun to the black QC tank for the resin hose and the ISO recirculation fitting for the ISO hose. Run the proportioning unit until you see the black resin in the hose turn clear. This should take about a gallon of resin. Turn the machine off. Now move the resin hose to the red QC tank. We will push the clear material in the line with the red resin. Close the center manifold from clear material and open the valve from red color tank and turn on proportioning unit and recirculate material. Again, it should take about a gallon of resin to push the clear material through. Turn the machine off. Now you have the resin line switched over to the new red color without having wasted a single drop of chemical. The last step is to add pigment to account for the clear resin we pushed into the black and red QC tanks. Add pigment at 80 grams per gallon for the amount of clear resin you added to each tank. Be sure to turn the agitator on before adding the pigment. The hoses can now be hooked back to the gun and you are ready to take a ratio check.
Remember, each component we've talked about has a specific purpose in the Rhino linings process and will help you create an ideal sprayed-on lining.